Great, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Anna Maria, for that introduction that explained very clearly some of the essential requirements for these deep learning techniques. I think the flavour of my talk is going to be a bit more high level, in that I want to kind of introduce many people who are attending this, I'm pleased to see, who may not have a particular interest in reverberation or the acoustics of an environment, and to try to give you a bit of a flavour of some of the capability we have for sensing in that area. And so in a way, I'm going to cover it in a fairly abstract way, and you won't find an equation in the talk anywhere. So nevertheless, I hope some of these concepts will give you some food for thought and some ideas maybe you can take away when thinking about your own experiments in the future. So starting at the top, I guess, in intelligent sensing, I guess there is the notion of some kind of entity, whether it's a biological system or a man-made system, interacting in its environment. And it has some idea of its goals and some capability for planning. And the interaction's primarily mediated through what it's able to sense and its actions that it can perform. And I guess that can give us capabilities to do things such as localize targets, or detect danger, to take evasive action, or interact socially in large-scale events or in small-scale events in a meaningful way as an intelligent being. And we do this through the capability of our senses. And given that today we're talking in this session about audio, I guess I would like to contrast that a little bit with the primary distal sense, vision, and maybe pick up on a few ideas for how these two senses may be able to combine and exploit their complementarity to better effect. So sight or vision, and in fact all the senses then will get processed in our brains. And I'm not going to go through the details of this schematic of neural processing in our brain, but I want to just point out that in this network of low-level and high-level operations, there's not only a crossover of information flowing from visual and auditory input, but also there's different kinds of processing happening at different levels, whether we're trying to find out where or what is going on. And therefore, I think that there's a bountiful opportunity, really, for not just exploiting the individual senses, but investigating architectures and how best to share and mediate information between the modalities. Okay, right, so let's get down to these senses. So vision, one of the characteristics that it has is a very high acuity where your eyeball is directed, and a field of view that's in front of you. And in contrast to that, hearing has less spatial resolution, but it's able to give you a full 4π, full surrounding sensing of an environment. So they have different spatial properties to begin with, but also whereas vision has some sensing for motion, hearing's ability to detect temporal changes is very much more sensitive. And so already we see some different strengths and weaknesses there. So if we're trying to extract information in a general information intelligent sensing kind of way, from a vision system, we might be interested in such problems as identifying people or tracking them, or working out what they're saying from a camera, or about objects, what are the objects and can we separate them? And from the environment, what kinds of objects can we see, and how might we therefore be able to either locate ourselves or reconstruct the scene? And similarly, on a hearing side, we have similar kinds of tasks, and immediately one can see for some of these, the audio pathway has some advantages, for example, for speech recognition, as we'll hear, I expect, from Thomas in a moment. But also source recognition and source separation, relating to some of those tasks on the D-case challenges, and environmental sound classification, scene classification, and oralization. I guess clearly there are opportunities to get input from both of these and make better decisions as a consequence too. Now in this talk, I'm going to talk about extracting environmental information from both audio and visual input, in fact. And the purpose of this is for sound rendering. So as Emmanuel mentioned, I was involved in a big spatial audio project. We were interested in creating the acoustics of those environments. And even though our target is an audio result, we found it useful to consider both of these sensing modalities as input. So this gives us the ability to create a sense of space within in the sound. And the reverb actually has the effect of binding sources together in a scene. So from a media production point of view, it's very useful to create and construct and bind and maintain continuity in a scene. And it also has the ability to give different depth and distance cues too. So I'm going to talk a little bit about acoustics, sound indoors, an audio approach, a visual approach, and some comments on audio-visual integration before concluding. So the room acoustics may be thought of as a filter operating on the dry, close mic'd signal that emanates from an audio source in this kind of a way. And so if you have a close microphone, you get a nice clean signal. Here's a spectrogram of some speech. And then at a distance away, where it's more affected by the reverberation, you can see this temporal smearing of the spectrogram in the reverberant case. And the physics of the problem indicate different kinds of wave behavior at different wavelengths. And therefore we need to think about the different frequencies in the sound, which range over 3 orders of magnitude in human hearing. A big range compared to the range of optical frequencies. At high frequency, there's effects like scattering. The middle range, we have a kind of mirror-like behavior, and the low frequency has modal behavior. And I'm going to concentrate mainly on this middle frequency, where the speech frequencies are dominant. And so from a sound source to a receiver or listener, we have a direct path that gives us the first bit of the impulse response, a set of early reflections that build up in density and complexity over time, and then a diffuse part where later on, really the sound is completely mixed and the sound seems to come from any direction at random. The effect of this is that if we want to model the acoustics, we need to take a separate approach to these early reflections that are largely coherent and localizable, and the later reflections that are incoherent and diffuse. So in our modeling, we've looked at the time and direction of arrival of these energy components in each of the early reflections. And then in the later part, over a longer time scale, we're really more interested in the overall spectral shape and how that decays over time. This has led us to a proposition for object-based audio, which is the next generation of immersive audio technologies, which offers the ability to carry both this kind of structural information, but also semantic information alongside the audio signal. And without going into detail, we have a proposal for a kind of parameterization following the depiction on the previous slide, which enables us to extract these parameters, these pieces of information that characterize the reverb. So from tests on a variety of room measurements, we're able to see whether that works to a certain extent using the kinds of objective evaluation metric used in architectural acoustics. But the real test comes from subjective listening tests, which unfortunately are rather time-consuming to conduct. Yet nevertheless, these show that we can use these parameters to change the impression of a room size or how immersed or enveloped a listener feels, and also this sense of distance of a source. And so that kind of brings the third dimension into 3D sound from these changing patterns of the reflections that one gets with different distances. Okay, so that's really the motivation for what we've been trying to investigate. And the challenge is how, from these real measurements, can we extract the information? One approach that we've investigated from audio measurements is to see whether we can use multiple measurements, in other words, from multiple sources in an environment within a microphone array to give us directional information, to try to work out where are these reflections coming from, and considering the time differences between the direct path and that reflected path, can we therefore find information about the room boundaries? And so this kind of random sample consensus-based method is an approach to pull out some of those peaks from the epochs, the reflections arriving over time, and hypothesize from the time differences where the reflection could have been. And where we get a consensus of a number of these, such as this plane at the bottom, we can then use that to support that hypothesis of there being a reflector. So from a set of these impulse responses from these different source locations, we can construct this hypothesis of a reflector and begin to get a reconstruction of the room geometry. And the idea of that then is that if you have some sound sources you want to put in, you've got the freedom to move them and insert them along that way. Now, audio has some challenges, as I mentioned at the outset. So we also have investigated a visual processing pipeline. And here we used a pair of 360 cameras to capture these kinds of rooms. And we have a processing pipeline that goes from that into depth map from the stereo to get the distance from the cameras, and a semantic segmentation using deep learning techniques, which enables us to get something like a crude reconstruction of the space. And then that is a basis for labeling up materials and then creating a kind of oralization, for example, as could be rendered in virtual reality. So here we are, we have the different objects and they're in the 3D geometry. There's the texture overlaid on that. And by labeling up those materials, we can render it in VR. So just to reflect for a moment on the different capabilities of the two pipelines. Clearly for the visual approach, cameras are required, and we're able to get this plausible interactivity, good spatial accuracy and recognition. But it has some difficulties with certain kinds of things like windows and mirrors and plain walls, or more generally for visual input if it's not in the field of view. Audio, on the other hand, requires both a source and microphones, and it can give you something that for our audio output sounds faithful and gives us good information about depth and material hardness, but its resolution is poor. And has problems sometimes making false assignments between reflections and surfaces. So clearly some opportunities there for integration. Okay, so just to sum up, I've introduced some ideas for sensing to extract environmental information. And we looked first at an audio processing pathway for this spatial acoustics problem. And then in fact, we looked at visual processing for a spatial acoustics problem too. I think we've explored or scratched the surface of some integration, but I think recognizing the broader complementarity of the two modalities, there are wider opportunities. I think there are some very interesting open questions around which machine learning architectures will best support this kind of deep audio-visual fusion. I'd like to put out a request for greater quantity of data sets. Although we see some emerging in the field, we see nothing like the organization and coherence that's been driven out through DCASE, for example, in terms of driving the community with its data sets. And I also wanted to pick up on the point that Anna Maria mentioned on some of the DCASE challenge solutions, where data augmentation has been an important part of the training process. And I believe this is to do with understanding, on the one hand, the kinds of variability in the thing that you are looking for, but also understanding and having a good model of the noise and the different types of noise that one can find in your signals. And I think on that basis, there's a good argument for considering, for digging deeper into the application. And I guess there are some other opportunities for VR and AR and mixed reality from this too. So finally, I think I want to claim that room acoustics does have a small part to play in a very many problems, on the basis that it has some important information that may be either type of noise or kind of signal variation, and can therefore give some significant improvement in whichever problem you're considering. So I'd just like to say thank you for some funders and co-authors. Please take a note of your questions for after Thomas's talk in a moment, and also here's some references for further reading. Thank you.